And if we look at how cystic fibrosis has improved and how it's saved the lives of many thousands of people, I think we can take great inspiration from this and apply this to our own disease. No two diseases are the same, and different diseases will require different funding strategies. That doesn't mean that we can't start trying. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. My name is Harry. If you haven't been here before, welcome to the channel. It is a pleasure to have you here. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that I think is incredibly interesting when it comes to a model for potentially developing treatments and finding a cure for long COVID. And that thing is venture philanthropy. Venture philanthropy is something that has been used incredibly effectively for conditions like cystic fibrosis. They have had a huge impact on the quality of life, the number of treatments that they've had there, and they have doubled the life expectancy in the last 20 years. So today we're going to have a little look at why I think that the model could be so effective for long COVID as well. We're going to dive into what cystic fibrosis is. We're going to dive into what venture philanthropy is, how it operates as a model, some of the kind of nooks and crannies around it. And then we're going to look at some of the potential problems that may arise as a result of it and how we could utilize this going forward. Hope you guys enjoy. So for those of you wondering what venture philanthropy is, this is a model that operates very much like a venture capital model, but in the interests of philanthropy. So essentially what happens here is we have a pool of investment, whether this be from governmental grants, whether it be from private investors, and rather than treating these grants like disposable income that we will just invest and spend, should I say, into other research projects or treatments, these funds will actually be congregated into a central fund, and from there they will be invested into a variety of different research projects. So take a venture capital fund, for example. There will be a pool of investors and they will put their money into this fund. So let's say investor A puts in 20 million, another investor puts in 10 million, and the total value of this fund is 100 million. Now, in the context of venture capital, these investors and this centralized fund will invest this money into a variety of different startup projects. So maybe they'll invest into a project here, maybe they'll invest 20% into another one here, and spread their funds across different areas of investment. Now, obviously, because these startups are very early stage, many of these startups will end up failing. But the fund is relying on those one or two gems, those one or two Ubers or Airbnbs that will hopefully skyrocket and go to the moon. So having invested into these companies, a lot of their investments will obviously go to zero, but these one or two investments will hopefully tremendously increase their value, maybe by 20 or 30x, and this will be the main source of their return on investment. Now, once these investments have come through, the returns on investment will be paid out to the shareholders and the investors in themselves. And a very similar thing can apply to venture philanthropy. However, in the context of venture philanthropy, what we are doing is not paying out profits to our investors, but we are reinvesting this profits back into other research projects. So if we take the example of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, what they did was they took their initial 20 or 30 million pounds of investment, and rather than spending it on a variety of different research projects and hoping that some of them would come through, they actually bought equity stakes in these projects and had patents and IPs on these different research projects. Now, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation were able to utilize this method, and the best example of this was their investment into Vortex. So from a £40 million investment, they then sold their royalties for $3.3 billion in 2014. Now, obviously, this has a huge impact on the disease in general, and they are able to invest $225 million every single year as a result of these royalty sales. So I find this incredibly inspiring because cystic fibrosis is, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small condition with only 100,000 people being affected worldwide. And despite this, they have managed to utilize this process and utilize this model, and they have developed multiple FDA-approved treatments. They have doubled their life expectancy in the last 20 years, and now it is in an incredible place. And I really think that long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome can learn from this, and we can do something very similar. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the boring stuff, but there's a couple of key components to the agreement structure that I'd like to point out. And the first one is the royalty interests. So rather than investing and gaining equity like a normal company, the foundation would invest and receive royalty interests when the company started selling treatments. So this not only encourages the company to actually promote and actually develop treatments that benefit people and actually work, it prevents them from just making pure profit. So rather than owning a percentage of the company and having equity, the foundation would actually gain percentage of the revenue should the drug become successful. Now, this prioritizes the interest being the development of successful drugs rather than the success of a specific company, and that helps to keep things in line with the mission. Now, another key component of these sorts of deals when investing into research projects is known as the interruption license. So, should the foundation invest into any company or research project and they start developing a drug, what they will hold is called an interruption license. And the fantastic thing about this is that they are able to take over any developments of the drug should the company switch away from drug development of that specific target. This means that a lot of the money isn't wasted. So for example, if a company started developing a drug, they started developing a treatment, and then they thought, nah, let's move on to something different. This protects the foundation and allows them to take ownership of that drug and the development that's made so far. So you might be thinking, why on earth would pharma companies benefit from this? Why would this be something that they would be interested in? And the answer is the financing from these kind of non-profits is interesting to pharma companies for a whole number of reasons. Now, the first one is low-cost, non-dilutive capital. And this is excellent for pharma companies because what it means is they are not giving up a huge chunk of equity when they're receiving funding. So like the conventional venture capital approach, what they would have to do is they would give up a chunk of equity in return for that investment. Now, this would mean that the investors hold a big stake in the company. That would lead to a lot of interference. And this is something that a lot of pharma companies don't necessarily like. Now, in this new model, the success of the project is based on royalties. So should the company go on to develop a successful treatment, then they will have to pay a percentage of royalties to the foundation in the future, but it doesn't interrupt them in the meantime. This allows the biopharma companies to invest higher risk, higher reward strategies because they don't have to give up this huge chunk of equity at the initial investment. Another major benefit for the pharma companies is having this resources and expertise. So foundations like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is something that I have visualized that we can set up for long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome, would have its own board of experts and people who are really knowledgeable in the area. And this is fantastic for the pharma companies as well, because this board of experts can provide their expertise. They can direct and steer where the research is going, and this can have a huge impact and huge benefit for the companies that they are investing in. Now, the final benefit is an engaged patient community with lots and lots of data. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had a really engaged patient community, and they as a foundation were able to harness this community and link it to a lot of the trials that they themselves were investing in. Now, if we look at this in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID, we see how engaged our patient community is. We see how much data there is in terms of people getting involved, whether it be Decode.me, whether it be apps like Eureka or Visible, and this is something that could be harnessed and utilized as well. And this would be another huge benefit for the companies that we're investing in, and is something that we definitely need to harness. So now I just want to re-highlight the success of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation because it is truly inspiring, and I think it's something that we can model ourselves on. So back in 1998, when the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was set up, there was basically a desert of treatments. There was nothing, and people had an incredibly poor quality of life. There was no real case for optimism. And if we fast forward 20 years, we now have multiple FDA approved treatments. The life expectancy of cystic fibrosis has doubled, and $225 million is invested every single year. Now, if we think what that level of investment would do for long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, it doesn't even beg the question. It doesn't even bear thinking about, because that kind of investment would do incredible amounts. And this is bearing in mind that their patient community is 100,000. And if we think that in the UK alone, we're estimated at 2 million, just think of the power that that has. And I think having this hyper-engaged patient community like we do really lends itself to operating this kind of model. And I think it would be something that we can work towards and an incredibly high impact endeavor. I'm also going to share on the screen the drug development pipeline for cystic fibrosis, because obviously they have improved the quality of life. They have a number of treatments that have just come out that affect people in an incredibly positive way. But if you just look at the drug development pipeline, you can see how many are being developed, how many are already at phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and it shows a really, really positive trend for the future. Now, this isn't to say that things are going to be easy, nor is it to say that long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome are in the exact same space and position as cystic fibrosis. There are some difficulties that we will encounter that they did, and there are some other difficulties that we will encounter that they did not have to because of the differential between the two diseases. Now, the first thing is biomarkers, and cystic fibrosis was in a somewhat fortunate, I hate to say fortunate, but somewhat fortunate position that they had a idea of what was going on in the condition before they started this venture philanthropy model. So they had an idea of the sort of biomarkers and the genes that were being affected that was causing this mucus buildup in the lungs. And that was something that they were able to kind of harness and engage and target as a result of their pharma research and interventions. Now, long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome is getting closer, but we are not in that position where we have a direct biomarker that we can measure. However, this can be mitigated, because if we look at how investment was distributed by Cystic Fibrosis Foundation at the initial points, we can see that there was a heavy skew towards research and developing new biomarkers at the beginning of the foundation. And then as we go along, we see more of a trend towards actual developing treatments. And that's the position that we're in right now. So what we would do with this foundation is we would start initially with highly skewed towards finding out the biomarkers, finding out potential mechanisms, and then as we learnt more and as we developed more towards treatments, we would shift this funding and we'd swap the weights over. But as I mentioned earlier, we do not have to sit idle just because we don't have any biomarkers. So what we can do is be investing into research projects. We can gain IP rights and patents from those successful research projects. And then what we can do is reinvest that capital time and time again to develop more and more accurate biomarkers and eventually move ourselves on towards treatments. Now, something that can't be overlooked is the initial capital as well. And cystic fibrosis obviously had an initial grant of around 30 or 40 million, but so much of this came from their charitable organization. And this is something that we are desperately missing when it comes to long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome. So I did a video on this fairly recently with Peter White, where we discussed the shortcomings of the charity sector when it comes to chronic fatigue syndrome. And we have such an engaged patient community. We have so many people who are affected, and we need to start harnessing them and their friends and family to allow us to raise money effectively like a business. And this is something that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation were able to do incredibly well. And this will allow us to gain this initial capital. And more than that, it will allow us to lobby in government. It will allow us to have more of a voice, but we need to have a centralized and professional outfit that operates like a business for us to do so. One issue that Cystic Fibrosis Foundation also faced was the issue of communication, and they struggled at points to get their message out. And this was especially so in the early 2000s when social media wasn't as big a thing. But I don't see this as a particular blocker for our case, because not only is our patient community incredibly engaged, incredibly willing to get involved in treatments, in research projects, but we also have the benefit of social media. So I don't see this as a blocker for our cause here. One very important issue is the issue of pricing should drugs become available in the near future. And this is an issue with the royalties-based model because it doesn't allow the foundation to set pricing once these drugs go to market. And there is no point having effective treatments and effective drugs if the price of them is so beyond reach of the ordinary person. Now, this is something that cystic fibrosis are tackling by engaging with insurers. They lobby on the behalf of their patients as well. And also the hope is that developing a more competitive drug marketplace, you will then lower the price for drugs to go onto the market. But this is something that we do need to be aware of and we do need to plan for the future. So I hope this has given you an idea of what venture philanthropy is and how it might benefit long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome and how we might follow what the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has done. This is very much open to editing, but I hope to leave you with a little roadmap of how we might follow suit. But firstly, we need to establish a credible charitable organization. This will be central to our theme of fundraising. It will help us to engage our patient community, and it will also help us to lobby within governments as well. We need a professional outfit that's able to be operated much like a business. It needs to have effective onboarding flows. It needs to have a centralized system to which we can invest our funds from as well. And it needs to be the point of reference for people when it comes to diseases like long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome. People need to see that much like they see Parkinson's and the MND Association and think, right, that is a place where I know where my money is going. I know that it's going to be used effectively, and I know that it is reputable. Secondly, we need to establish a centralized board of scientific advisors. That will allow us to make decisions on where we need to invest next, where the biggest opportunities lie, and allow us to make decisions on which mechanisms are worth investing into and which are not. Now, the third point is something that we'd already started, but something that we can work on further, and that is to build a super strong patient community. Now, we already have fantastic apps like Visible and Eureka, where people are congregating and sharing ideas and treatments and what might be working and what might not. But we need to centralize this even further because we have so many people affected, so many friends and families who have a vested interest in the development of a treatment and a cure. And if we can harness and centralize this patient community, we can have power to no end. Now, the fourth point would be add a venture philanthropy arm to this organization. So, as I mentioned previously, we would start with investing in academic research. We would try to really knuckle down on the mechanisms. We would try to understand what exactly is going on, try and develop a biomarker. And then as we go along, what we can do is shift this research away from just research into developing treatments. But all along the way, we will be investing and we'll be getting IP rights, royalties, and patents. And then should we have a successful project, we will gain the benefits and reap the rewards of that. And we will gain money from that. And that will then be reinvested into future projects. And this operates much like a flywheel. And before we know it, we'll be in a position much like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, where hopefully something like a mere 30 or 40 million pound investment will come back as 3.3 billion. Now, the fifth point is something that I mentioned previously, and there is no point having effective drugs if they cost astronomically high amounts. And I've written a few points that I think might benefit us, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. So, firstly, we could lobby for financial assistance programs. So once a drug is developed and is proven to be effective, we can lobby for financial assistance programs that will help people who are in worse economic straits and help them to get access to the drug. But again, this will only be possible if we have an effective charitable organization that can lobby in government on our behalf. And the second, this is more relevant in the US, but we need to engage with insurers to make sure that the pricing is going to be fair. And we need to make sure that these decisions are made on a quality of life overview. And this is something that is very important from an insurance perspective. Thirdly, we can establish a free helpline that allows patients to navigate the legal, financial, and social problems of acquiring these expensive drugs. And finally, we can accelerate the development of different drugs, which will increase the competition in the marketplace and drive the prices down. So I wanted to leave you with this. Long COVID and ME/CFS are conditions that affect millions and millions worldwide. And obviously, these are very heterogeneous conditions. They have a ton of variety in how they present, but this doesn't mean that they are untreatable. And as we've seen from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, previously thought untreatable diseases do have the potential to be treated and do have the potential to make a huge difference when it comes to the quality of life impact. No two diseases are the same, and different diseases will require different funding strategies. There's obviously different diseases with different market sizes, different diseases with different mechanisms, but that doesn't mean that we can't start trying. This approach of venture philanthropy is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all method, but it's something that I think we can take a lot of motivation from. And if we look at how cystic fibrosis has improved and how it's saved the lives of many thousands of people, I think we can take great inspiration from this and apply this to our own disease. It might not be a quick or easy road, but with the right commitment and the right strategy, I believe that we can get there. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that and I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions that you want to run by me or any ideas that you want to bounce around, I'm all ears and I'm always happy to hear any kind of feedback. So please leave it below in the comments and I will see you again very shortly.